Welcome to This Jungian Life. Three good friends and Jungian analysts, Lisa Marciano, Deborah Stewart, and Joseph Lee, invite you to join them for an intimate and honest conversation that brings a psychological perspective to important issues of the day.
I'm Lisa Marciano, and I'm a Jungian analyst in Philadelphia.
I'm Joseph Lee, and I'm a Jungian analyst in Virginia Beach, Virginia.
I'm Deborah Stewart, a Jungian analyst on Cape Cod.
Hello. We have an exciting announcement this week. This Jungian Life is going to try, going forward, to share video as well as audio. So for those of you who have been listening to us, but maybe have wondered what the heck we look like, you can head on over to YouTube and have that curiosity satisfied, for better or worse. So yeah, we're going to see how that goes. This week on the podcast, we're going to be talking about guilt. I think it's such an interesting topic. It is a common emotion that has many different aspects to it, and it's very important psychologically. I would say that guilt is important to our psychological growth, and it plays a big role in the history even of psychoanalysis. So we have lots of ground to cover today, and let's go ahead and jump in and get started.
Well, I think we could say that guilt is part of the archetypal matrix of human beings because it shows up in so much myth. So when we look at the primary myth of the Western world, which right now is the Judeo-Christian myth, the first act that Adam and Eve do is to disobey a rule and to feel ashamed, after which they hide themselves, which sets in motion the whole rest of the great mythopoetic story of original sin and redemption, which is central, I think, to the Western psyche.
Yeah. So that opens up the difference between shame and guilt. Adam and Eve recognized all of a sudden that they were naked, and that's shame. But they also feel guilt because they know that they ate fruit from the forbidden tree. So we have both folded in there. You have broken a rule that the parent, in this story, the Lord God, has given you. And isn't that our first experience of guilt, of, snitching the proverbial cookie, but doing something we were told not to do?
So the story, which is a great place to begin this discussion, I think. Thank you, Joseph, for lifting that up. And it does help us understand the difference between shame and guilt, which is a great thing to clarify. But it also tells us right away that there's a connection between guilt and unconsciousness. And Jung felt very much that guilt was an important aspect of individuation, that it was kind of the first step toward individuation was guilt. It's an awareness of ourselves. It's an awareness of how we impact the world. And it's the opposite of innocent. So when we're innocent, we believe that everything bad is out there. When we take on board that, no, that's in me too, then that's a state of guilt. But it's also a state, like Adam and Eve, of consciousness. And Jung felt that this was absolutely essential for psychological growth. So if I can just read a quick quote, he said, the view that good and evil are spiritual forces outside us, and that man is caught in the conflict between them, is more bearable by far than the insight that the opposites are the ineradicable and indispensable preconditions of all psychic life, so much so that life itself is guilt. So think about that. Jung is saying life itself is guilt. That's fun.
Well, what it brings up for me is that infants don't feel guilt necessarily, and creatures in the forest don't. That when we are moving exclusively from an instinctive frame, there's simply what the senses notice and how the senses are responding, moving towards an object, away from an object, protecting, fleeing. But there isn't a moral conscience, that there isn't a set of rules that have been prescribed to contain our primality. So as soon as we become aware of rules, then we sit in that place of consciousness that you were bringing up, Lisa, of whether or not we, as somewhat sovereign egos, either comply or refuse to comply with various rules. So, Deb, as you're saying, sometimes parents come and say, listen, if you do this, or you better not do that, because you'll have hell to pay. There's a way of establishing rules and even a system of punishment as a way of regulating future behavior. And that happens very, very early on. As soon as we have a sense that an infant can orient to us, we begin to steer them in one direction or another, which, by the way, has to happen. I mean, that's essential. So when we individuate later on in life, and by the way, Jung said this is a later life dynamic, that we've integrated the rules of the culture. Hopefully we have used them to our advantage by the time we get to midlife. They've also colonized us in terms of what we think is okay to consider, to say, to act. And as the self begins to assert, all those alignments with the rules come up for question.
I'm having a reaction to that, which is that you're focusing on the way that we're kind of told by the culture what is and is not okay. And of course that's true. But I'm also thinking about the fact that there really is an interpersonal aspect to guilt. There's a way that what happens is we become aware of our impact on the other. And that feels not like it's put into us from the outside, but that it can be a deep, deep, heartfelt, very authentic reaction that can bring about great guilt.
So that leads into sort of some of the stages of moral development. And a man named Lawrence Kohlberg made, kind of articulated what the stages are. And that the first stage is just obedience and punishment. That these are the rules, and if you don't obey the rules, you'll be punished somehow. So we avoid the punishment, but we don't really understand the rules. And then what comes next as we become children and adolescents is developing empathy, which is important for developing good relationships and maintaining the social order for its own sake. Things go more smoothly. And if I do this, it will hurt my friend so-and-so, will hurt his or her feelings. And I will regret that. I will feel guilty about that. And eventually we can work our way up to real principles of social contracts, individual rights, respect, and eventually universal principles that we really believe in. So it goes back to what you were saying, Lisa, about the development of consciousness, and that is inherent in one of our myths of origin, the Adam and Eve story, and how we think about transgression, right, wrong, my way or someone else's way, whose needs and rights take precedence. And that was very much part of Kohlberg's whole theory of moral development, is not just what you do or don't do, but how do you think about it? How do you make that decision?
What I think I'm hearing emerging in the discussion is a couple of different valences of response. If we have some sense of empathy, and we act, speak in a certain way, and we are aware that the person who is hearing or being acted upon goes into a state of distress in one way or another, that the mirror neurons in our brain kind of echo the distress, pain, suffering that we've induced in another person, and then we have a sense, there's some connection between what I've done, maybe as a child or an adult, and the discomfort that I've caused in another person. And I think that empathic response gives us significant information about the impact. Because I think that when reason, when law, when rules are applied and there is no sense of empathy, no sense of compassion, there is a kind of cold and icy cruelty that one is vulnerable to. Which even in our legal system, we have laws, but judges, for the most part, are able to mediate the repercussions of breaking a law based on the personal experiences, remorse, regret, the suffering of the one who has committed the offense, tempers the degree of correction that might come forward. The shadow side of that is, I think what Jung might have said, is a fundamentally unconscious feeling function, where we are responding to the emotional tones of the people around us, but we are not even clear whether we've caused them, or whether or not the other person's suffering is pathologic, and therefore we might actually reject responsibility or a sense of guilt for it, because it doesn't really belong to us, although it's happening in our proximity or happening as a result of a choice that we had made. And this is where there's so much gray area around the idea of individuation. Who is responsible for the suffering that rises up in one's soul? And of course, philosophers have been asking this for a really long time. How much of our experience of reality, painful or pleasurable, is actually self-generated? And if we are asking that question, then what the responsibilities are to each other about keeping other people comfortable comes into question.
You know what that brings up for me, Joseph, is the author of The Road Less Traveled, M. Scott Peck. I think he's a psychiatrist. And he has this quote that I read a million years ago that I've just never forgotten. I've probably shared it before in the podcast. Something like, this is the paraphrase, neurotic people take too much responsibility, and people with personality disorders take too little. And to me, that's just so kind of clear. And I think it kind of gets at what you're talking about, because we can easily be induced to take on guilt that isn't really ours. And likewise, sometimes we have a tendency to not take responsibility for something that is our responsibility, and we push it on to someone else, and we try to make them feel guilty for it.
So we're talking about guilt trips of when one is foisted upon us versus when we foist one upon someone else.
And then inducing guilt in another person becomes a tactic to regulate our environment, to make it more comfortable, to kind of mediate our own complexes.
So there's an association between, we said earlier, guilt and consciousness, and now it looks like we're circling around this connection between guilt and responsibility, right? Because you wouldn't feel guilty for something unless you felt a modicum of responsibility.
Or had been convinced that
Yes.
one in some way was responsible. And the difficulty in that is, and we're seeing it in the current culture, is that it opens us up to I'm trying to think of how to say this clearly. It opens us up to creating a sense of false causality, which can actually interfere with our ability to find a true resolution. So, if we've been disadvantaged and we haven't been able to get a job, we can begin to blame people and try to make corporations guilty because they aren't hiring people who have a certain level of education, certain qualities, certain traits. We see that it's this corporations should be guilty of not providing for me or the people in my group. And that can become a lifelong attitude which can blind us from asking other questions which are more relevant to Jungian analysis. What complexes do I have? In what way is my own unconscious interfering with my success? Might there be other much more complicated reasons that we are not getting our needs met in the way that we would like?
Yeah. So once we turn to the external world, as if the external world is guilty, we're really in the territory of blame. But Jung has something really terrific to say about this. He says, only a fool is interested in other people's guilt, since he cannot alter it. The wise man learns only from his own guilt. He will ask himself, who am I that this should happen to me? To find the answer to this fateful question, he will look into his own heart. So this has really all been such an amplification of the guilt trip when we believe that other people, institutions, systems are responsible, that they are guilty. And I think Jung hits the nail on the head. We cannot alter it, but we can ask, who am I that this should happen to me?
It seems to me that one of the things we're circling around is that you can have this sort of guilt that kind of goes nowhere, and I imagine we'll talk more about it later, but I think about it as being related to this idea of neurotic suffering, where, it's just, maybe it's just hand-wringing and you just feel guilty all the time, but it doesn't bring about any shift in attitude or personality change. Whereas I think Jung is often talking about guilt, that if you really take it in and you really feel it and you suffer it and you take responsibility for it, it can, like we said earlier, it can be the first step on the journey to individuation. It can bring consciousness. It can bring about a change in personality. Just like the quote you just read, Deb, I think that's, kind of what he's getting at there. And part of that guilt that changes us, there is often a very important interpersonal part of that, because when we feel that kind of guilt, we look for expiation. We often want to confess our guilt. And I think I want to share a personal story, because this is a very early memory that was very important to me for a long time. I would say it probably still is. And I'm not sure exactly what to make of it, but I just maybe want to feed it into this conversation and we can talk about it. So I must have been 3 or 4. I was very young, and it had rained a lot, and there was kind of all kinds of puddles and standing water in the yard. And I put on my little rain boots, I guess, or my mom probably helped me put them on. And I went and, you can imagine you're 3 years old and there's lots of puddles. So I'm splashing around. I'm having a great time. I'm probably off in my own world. And I come in to the garage and I take off my boots, which are filled with rainwater, muddy water. And I'm leaning against the garage wall to take them off. And as I do so, this muddy water spills on the wall. And for some reason, that particular thing, something went in a new way. I'm sure, of course, I was 3 or 4. I'm sure every day of my life I'd made a mess or done something that, was inconvenient or difficult. But somehow seeing that stain on the wall filled me with something like despair. Mm-hmm. I felt like, I can even feel myself getting a little emotional talking about it. Feeling like I had ruined the house. I had ruined the house. I hadn't meant to. I knew that. But my actions had this irrevocable stain on my house, on this wall. And I began to weep. My mother was like, honey, what's wrong? And I said, I ruined the wall. And she said, oh, that's not a problem at all. It'll wipe right off. It was so healing that I had this experience of real guilt, true guilt, because I had done that. But what I learned from it was, and that's okay. It can be wiped clean. I can be forgiven. I mean, that's like the ultimate Christian experience, isn't it? I was not raised Christian, by the way. But that is a fundamental aspect of Christian theology, that you will sin and you will be forgiven. And so when I think about that experience and sort of what was going on, Debbie, we're talking about kind of the developmental aspects of guilt. And this happened for me, at this kind of very young age. And what was going on for me and what comes up for me is that guilt is an awareness of the impact that we have on each other and on the world. And in that sense, it goes back to this idea about consciousness.
When you tell that story, I think about this very primal archetype in all of us that has to do with the magical spoiling of something that is pristine.
Yes.
And that's a priori. It's in us before we have experienced it the first time. And we're able to know this, even if it's just a perfectly painted white wall. Mm-hmm. I have done something to interfere with the perfection.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it is very archetypal, and I think it goes back to the story of Adam and Eve. I mean, that was a kind of experience of an archetype. And guilt was an important part of it.
I find myself, for some reason, thinking about the difference between guilt and remorse. And maybe they are synonymous. But some part of me puts them in different categories. There's something about guilt that has to do with moral expectations and kind of defined rules, that in order to be found guilty, the correct behavior or the guardrails, have to be clearly established. Remorse is something that I think is more sophisticated. That whether or not I'm guilty of something, I still wish something had not happened. I wish I had not been involved in one thing or another, and it pains me as I revisit my participation in something or other. it feels deeper, sadder to me.
Yeah. It's more feelingful. I mean, I think maybe that's what I was getting at before when I said there's this kind of guilt that's just like hand-wringing and kind of goes nowhere, and you just feel guilty and you just kind of spin your wheels, versus it piercing your heart.
Absolutely. I think that is the difference between guilt and remorse, is the deep regret because I have a feeling state. Whereas guilt, if it's very rule-based, I mean, kids do this all the time. They bargain about it, of, to use the old trope about snitching a cookie from the cookie jar. Can I get away with it? And if I can get away with it, and I have deniability, that's one thing. Do I really feel the greater reason for not doing this? That, it's because Mom cares about me and we have a relationship, and cookies shouldn't be eaten before dinner, and a whole bunch of other stuff, and I'm betraying my mother's trust. Whereas guilt, for kids, often has to do with I've broken a rule. So it goes into one of these moral sort of principle things of there's good, there's bad, there's this rule, there's that rule. Whereas remorse is I really hurt somebody. I hurt something and I wish I hadn't. And I regret it.
Well, and
it's much more relational and much more connected to the other.
And one can feel remorse whether or not one was found guilty for the transgression, because if we just take the larger sense of the word guilt, we have been judged, that something has evaluated our behavior. Now, Freud talked about the superego, that we certainly can have an internal judge that sometimes is less compassionate than a physical judge might be, that is evaluating our compliance with various mores and standards. But even in a legal case, when somebody is found guilty, the judge is assessing whether or not they have remorse. And if someone does not show remorse, the legal system becomes more concerned.
Yes.
And often is more harsh, because there's an understanding that remorse is a self-regulating process, and that we can have some confidence in that part of ourselves that punishes the ego by feeling badly about something that's been done. So we may not necessarily need to societally punish someone, because the correction is going inside their own hearts.
And that emphasizes the difference, really, again, between remorse and guilt. And the legal system finds people guilty or innocent to some extent, regardless of how the person feels. We would like to see someone exhibit remorse, but it's codified. There are lots of rules and regs, lots and lots and lots of legal tomes and lawyers and arguments, and can you prove it? That doesn't necessarily involve human factors like heart.
So, I think that when we're talking about guilt, the feeling, sometimes we have that kind of just guilt feeling like, oh, I got caught snitching, sticking the cookie. And sometimes the guilt we feel is this much deeper, remorseful experience. And I wonder if that's what Jung means here. He says the first step in individuation is a tragic guilt. The accumulation of guilt demands expiation.
And that reminds me of remorse,
yeah. And I think this. Go ahead, Joseph.
Oh, I was just going to say, when I feel guilty of something, there's a feeling like I hope I don't get caught. Like there's a different kind of feeling. Like you accidentally ran a red light, or maybe purposefully, and you're like, God, I hope I don't get busted for this thing. Versus some much deeper feeling we have about
Yeah.
failing ourselves or failing
Right.
some
Or
kind of
failing someone we
social
care
expectation.
About. Yeah. But I want to go back to this idea of expiation, because I think when we are guilty, we do need to do something to atone for it. And I want to open up the truth that this is sometimes something that plays out in an analysis or in someone's life when you're carrying this sort of guilt or remorse. How does that affect us? What do we do if we haven't atoned for it, and maybe how does it show up in the analyst's office?
Well, I think we're in that realm of, gosh, I hope nobody finds out about it. When we think about Jung and Freud's idea of the neurotic isolation, things have been done to us, we have done things, we have discovered things, and there's a pressure to want it to be secret. And yet, it has so much emotional intensity, there's so much conflict around what's happened that it drains a huge amount of vitality away from ego functioning, and then we become symptomatic. So being able to confess is the first stage of analysis. And the value of it was called the piercing of the neurotic isolation.
Yeah. And Jung talks about that too, of course. He says, it is indeed no small matter to know of one's guilt and one's own evil, and there is certainly nothing to be gained by losing sight of one's shadow. When we're conscious of our guilt, we are in a more favorable position. We can at least hope to change and improve ourselves. Yeah. So I think we are veering into the realm of shadow, of, the time I did something that I feel is heinous, and it might be something, to use your example, Joseph, of, sort of running a red light, or I didn't come to a full stop at that stop sign. But what really rankles is the part where we feel horribly guilty about it. And I think we probably all have some things in our lives that we feel, horribly guilty about. And so we do want to be able to tell somebody. Sometimes it's a priest, sometimes it's a parent, sometimes it's a teacher, sometimes it's an analyst. And it's in some systems, it is the other who expiates our guilt and says, if you do these 3 things, or don't do it again, no, I won't, I'm really sorry, that then we are cleansed by the other and that exchange. But hopefully in analysis, we can learn to understand ourselves better, and that there is that part of ourselves that is shadow. And we can expiate our own guilt by recognizing this darker part of ourselves.
And taking responsibility for it. And one of the things that
yes.
I'm thinking about, Deb, that when you were talking, what came up for me is the way that, feelings of real, true, deep guilt kind of make us feel cut off from everyone else. Like we are no longer... We can't be a part of the rest of humanity. I mean, I worked with Vietnam vets for a while, and the ones that had done terrible things there, they did not feel like they belonged with the rest of us. And that's why absolution, expiation, atonement is so healing. It's like me, that little 3-year-old Lisa, I felt like, oh my God, I can't be part of the world anymore because I've done this terrible thing. And then my mom's like, let me just get a sponge, and it wipes right off. I was like, I have been saved, I'm thinking actually of 2 works of literature just popped into my mind. One is Donna Tartt's The Goldfinch, which won the Pulitzer some number of years ago, and also the other really famous novel about guilt, Crime and Punishment, by Dostoevsky. And in both of these novels, there is this kind of crime that the hero commits, or anti-hero if you like, and has to live with that guilt for the rest of the book. So in The Goldfinch, if you don't know it, Theo kind of accidentally steals a painting. And, of course, in Crime and Punishment, Raskolnikov murders the old pawnbroker. And both of them, their personalities are sort of shaped and warped, and their behaviors by this sense of guilt that they carry. And in some way, it's such a powerful symbol, I think. I think we all kind of carry a sort of existential guilt. That just by kind of being here and being us, we have, Joseph, like you said before, kind of like broken an original purity. I want to just take a second to share this story that a colleague once shared with me. So she was working with someone. He was, when this little boy was 10 or 11, he had a bow and arrow. And he would, just play with it in the backyard. And the family had some rules about it. They had set up a hay bale that he could pierce with the bow and arrow. That's what he would aim at. And there were rules, you cannot aim it this way. You cannot aim it if anyone's around. And one day this little boy was, being careless, and he was shooting his bow and arrow, and he accidentally hit a neighbor and caused a neighbor to lose an eye. And he had, it wasn't his fault, but he'd been careless. And there was whatever process there was at the time. And then he went about his life, but he felt tormented. And he'd been therapist after therapist. And the therapist would say, it wasn't your fault. You were just a kid. You didn't know better. Didn't relieve his symptoms. He was having difficulties in his career, difficulties in his relationship. Finally, he came to see my colleague, and she said, you did something really bad, and you need to atone for it. And that was a relief to this man. And together they worked out a plan. And I think it involved him making a donation to a charity and doing volunteer work for some extended period of time for a charity in expiation of this thing that he had done that had caused him to carry this guilt for all these years. So I think that as therapists, we have to remember that, guilt, when it's a real thing, when it's deeply felt, when it's remorseful, can't just be waved away with, oh, you didn't mean it, or you didn't know any better.
Yeah. And people do that to themselves. I'm thinking about what you were saying, Joseph, about, sort of the first stage of confession, of people sentence themselves to sometimes, some version of hard labor, psychologically speaking, of, the kid in the family who gets out and gets ahead and leaves siblings behind. I think I have some relation to that, and goes back to atone for, I got out while the getting was good.
Survivor guilt.
And right, survivor guilt, and also that I, whoever that person is, I owe my siblings this, and this. So many years, money for education, whatever it might be. And I'm especially thinking about people who emigrate to the United States, and a family sends one person over and pools all their resources to get that person here into college, and that there is that kind of survivor guilt of, now that I've got a degree and I'm earning a good salary, I don't know how many millions of people send money home. And that what we owe, what we need to do to atone for our good fortune, as well as what we may have done wrong.
Yeah, when I worked with the vets, many of them gave blood every month.
I think that a number of people who go into some form of service industry, religious service, social services, are trying to heal themselves in one way, but also trying to balance something. And just as you said when we were talking about Jung's concept of individuation, sometimes even just breaking free of the parental vision for the child leaves them feeling that they need to give something back to the world, give back to other people, if not exactly to their siblings or their parents particularly. And this goes, I think, to Jung's idea of compensation, that the psyche is always seeking balance. Sometimes the way we do that could be more elegant, could be more successful, but it's inherent in us to want to find that balanced resting point inside of the psyche. So as you said, with these Vietnam vets, and I've seen some documentaries where people will lead vets back to Vietnam so that they can have some kind of a reparative engagement with the survivors and their children, how deeply meaningful, how much pain that they feel, how important it is to experience and confess and feel remorse, and to have the other person see the pain that the perpetrator is carrying, creates a kind of balance inside of the psyche. And sometimes it's not quite enough that people can have these penances and reparative experiences and still struggle to feel some sense of peace inside of them.
Yeah, definitely.
And that takes me back in a way to shadow of how much of the guilt is about, what has happened in the external world to an other person or a number of others, and how much is the process internal of what is stopping me from being able to forgive myself, despite, let's say, having atoned, despite all kinds of reparative acts and efforts. And I'm thinking about there is a psychological phenomenon of sort of overscrupulosity.
Yeah.
And the false belief that I should do everything perfectly, or this one little glitch in my work or whatever it is, taints and ruins the whole thing. Sort of related to OCD at times. And maybe a little bit of a kind of inverted narcissism that, do I really think that I could do this task or whatever it is perfectly?
Well, it's a kind of negative inflation, right? I'm so powerful that if I even think this thought, the whole thing's going to topple or something.
Well, I was also thinking about, I hope I'm getting this right, I think it was Albert Ellis who did rational emotive therapy. This is ringing a bell back from my social work training, where he really felt that guilt was most often self-imposed, and he called it masturbation. That we right. That we have, we integrate all of these musts, shoulds, thou shalts, which I think is part of a Nietzschean vision as well.
Yeah.
And that we have to challenge all of these must-dos, the thou shalts, and ask ourselves which one of those are really valid and which are irrational. And am I creating my own misery? And if so, why?
Right.
What is psyche trying to get to, even though it might not be doing it really well or very successfully at the moment? So I've always thought that word masturbation was wonderfully transgressive and kind of lights up your mind for a minute there.
Right. That, well, it's so there's a school of psychotherapy that is known as AEDP, and I don't think I can get that acronym right. Accelerated Experiential. I'm not going to be able to do it, but it's really great. And one of the things that they're very interested in is the way that an emotion like guilt, which they consider to be a secondary emotion, is used to defend against a primary emotion, which I think is just in this masturbation realm. That you can be like, oh, I feel I'm the worst person in the world. I'm so sorry I didn't take out the trash this week. You must be so frustrated with me. You must really hate me. That kind of thing. It's like, well, but what's the feeling underneath? Is the feeling underneath, incredible fear and vulnerability that your partner's going to leave you? Is it a feeling of, anger that you feel like you're under their partner's thumb, that you have to take out the trash? What is it? But it's kind of, you just kind of swirl in this endless, meaningless, going nowhere guilt. Without it penetrating and making any kind of change.
So it can be sort of a cover for something else. That it's easier to feel guilty. You're a great example of like, oh, I'm so sorry I didn't take out the trash. I really regret it. I hope you can forgive me. It's a little bit about, the lady doth protest too much. We might suspect that underneath these profuse apologies, a little bit of a, sort of screw you. I didn't take out the trash and I was feeling resistant or maybe hostile. But you can't get on me if I carry on about how horrible and bad I feel, can you?
So in that way, it's really strategic.
Sort of.
Yeah. Well, or we might even say manipulative, although I don't think that everyone that does that is consciously manipulative. Right. But we've just learned that it kind of calls off the dogs.
I'd also...
Yeah. If I beat myself up first, then you won't do it to me.
I wanted to take a little bit of a pivot because I think it's relevant to what's happening in our culture, because Jung wrote about collective guilt.
Yeah, that's a great
He
topic.
spent a lot of time analyzing what he think went wrong with Germany as it was building up towards launching World War II, the atrocities that were committed, and also observing the German psyche at the end of the war and afterwards, as the cultural psyche was struggling to integrate the amount of pain that had been inflicted. And I'll read a quote. It's a bit lengthy, but I think it can open this category because there's a lot of dialogue about should one culture or another feel really guilty for the adversity that ancestors had inflicted upon each other. This comes from volume 10 of the collected works. Psychological collective guilt is a tragic fate. It hits everybody, just and unjust alike. Everybody who was anywhere near the place where the terrible thing happened. Naturally, no reasonable and conscientious person will lightly turn collective into individual guilt by holding the individual responsible without giving him a hearing. He will know enough to distinguish between the individually guilty and the merely collectively guilty. But how many people are either reasonable or conscientious, and how many take the trouble to become so? I'm not very optimistic in this respect. Therefore, although collective guilt, viewed on the archaic and primal level, is a state of magical uncleanness, yet, precisely because of the general unreasonableness, it is a very real fact, which no European outside Europe and no German outside Germany can leave out of account. So he's holding a number of different attitudes, I hear in the quote. He's acknowledging that collective guilt, a kind of magical uncleanness, or a participation mystique, this group part of the psyche, does vibrate with images and with feelings and experiences that the culture has participated in. And he's challenging us to differentiate between historic collective guilt and individual responsibility, that it does matter that those things are separate. And at this point when he was writing, he was observing how Germans, for instance, whether or not they lived in Germany for generations or not, still felt some sense of horror and guilt in themselves as the stories of the Holocaust began to emerge. And we can hear Jung wrestling with how to psychologically understand this collective and individual responsibility. So he calls it a state of magical uncleanness.
It is so hard, isn't it? I remember, this is going to be a bit of a wander, I'm afraid. But I remember when I was working for a refugee organization in Bosnia, I thought I was there to do good and save people. And then we had some things happen where there was a horrible car accident. And it was one of our staff were driving, and a 13-year-old girl was essentially who was Bosnian, was essentially brain dead because of it. Now it wasn't anyone trying to hurt anyone, but we had done this terrible thing, and my organization was part of it. And this guy wound up in a Bosnian prison, which is no fun. And so of course we found some way to basically bribe the locals to eventually kind of spring him, or I don't even remember the details. But, I felt, not like I wanted this guy to rot in a Bosnian prison either, but I didn't feel very good being part of this organization that had to kind of do this dirty dealing, which of course is what any of us always have to do when we're out in the real world. The fantasy that there could be a kind of magical cleanness, is a childish fantasy. And so I think that this awareness that in little ways or in big, we are all part of systems that are imposing.
Yes.
Every day we wake up and fire up my gas range to make my coffee. I'm contributing to global warming. I mean, there's no way to be free from guilt. And I'm not wanting to conflate sort of being in Germany in the 30s with my morning coffee routine, but there is this sort of range. There is this place where we're all guilty, and how do we wrestle with that?
As I'm taking that in, I am for some reason wanting to stand in the difference between guilt and responsibility.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Which both have different valences. No one is prosecuting people for using K-cups yet, or flushing wet wipes down the sewer pipes, which are causing these massive kind of problems.
Really?
Yeah, huge problems in these infrastructure systems, and on. That our lives, such as they are, contribute a burden to various systems, natural and structural.
Mm-hmm.
So we can feel guilt, but that does not always translate into the ability to respond. And this is where I think a transition needs to happen. That we might feel bad about a lot of things. And let's just say we've sorted out what's neurotic and what's reasonable. Like, we feel reasonably guilty about one thing or another. But it's the ability to respond, to be response-able to the systems that we're participating in, that's required for any sense of expiation. And our ability to respond could be quite small, like we decide we're going to not use K-cups or use ones that are biodegradable, for instance, or we're no longer going to flush wet wipes, down and clog, the sewer systems, or that we're going to recycle, our cans. So by deciding there is a response that we are capable of, and choosing to respond allows us to stay somewhat in balance around that feeling of guilt, so that it doesn't show up in other strange, unconscious ways like self-sabotage or self-isolation or any number of kind of masochistic impulses.
It really goes back into the whole big quagmire of existential guilt. I mean, in Buddhist precepts, everything is connected. We're all connected. Past, present, people who live on the opposite side of the world. And what do we do with atrocities that have been committed? Certainly in our culture, no culture, I think, is free of this kind of history. And how are we, as you said, Joseph, response-able? And do we feel connected to our history and to our culture that I'm going to make the decision not to buy certain products, or certainly not to flush them down the toilet. I know somebody that tries very hard not to use his printer. He doesn't want to contribute more disposable paper to trash piles. But I think it comes to, am I connected with my wider world? Do I feel responsible to do some small part just because I am part of a much bigger
And this
web?
goes, I think, to the social experiment of truth and reconciliation.
Yes.
That first, to discover the facts, which sometimes are very explicit and sometimes are very opaque, but to discover what facts one can, to be able to hear and integrate the truth that is discovered and to be reconciled with it. That those who have suffered and those who have created suffering reconcile, which means that, well, it means many things, but one is that the defense against the truth is surrendered. And for many people that have been terribly aggrieved and injured, that is enormously important. Fathers who have gone to prisons to talk with criminals who have killed their children, and needing to see them, needing to feel that the person that's caused harm is reconciled, is in alignment with reality around the pain that the father is carrying, is important. The outcome can't be changed. The son has been lost, for instance. This terrible, terrible thing has happened. But we need to have a sense that those who have suffered and those who have contributed to the suffering are standing in the same field of reality.
And there is research that shows that when the wrongdoer feels bad and can take responsibility for it, it reduces the victim's suffering. Simply acknowledging in a truly heartfelt way, like the accident you were talking about, Lisa, of, this cannot be undone. And yet I think sometimes we go to legalistic definitions of guilt and punishment when things could be maybe not repaired, but at least ameliorated by two people standing in the same field and the wrongdoer saying, I am not only sorry, but this will be a heartfelt sorrow in me for the rest of my life.
Well, and that kind of process.
That both people are suffering.
It gives the guilty person a way back. It may not be forgiveness exactly, but at least it gives them a way back.
Yeah.
And that has been the spirit of justice, I think, since the Code of Hammurabi and the Judeo-Christian system of judging and punishment, is that punishment, penance, archetypally, is supposed to be restorative. That balance in the collective psyche ostensibly would be restored. We often use the term made whole. For instance, if somebody has been subject to financial malfeasance, being whole would mean that my money is returned to me. I'm made whole. Yeah. So justice at its core is an attempt to balance a scale cosmically, psychologically, culturally, and we as a species have a great resistance to that, and we as individuals have great resistance to it. Another quote that's rather short, which has to do with projection as a way of defending against a sense of appropriate guilt and remorse. He writes, "In the breakup, the personal components that have been integrated with such pains are once more sucked into the outside world. The individual loses his guilt and exchanges it for infantile innocence. Once more he can blame the wicked father for this and the unloving mother for that, and all the time he is caught in this inescapable causal nexus, like a fly in a spider's web, without noticing that he has lost his moral freedom."
Wow. That's a great one.
Wow.
And we see that right now as various agencies or laws are trying to hold industries responsible for polluting rivers, for instance, and other political factors in the culture are trying to say, well, that never happened. People haven't done these things. We have to take away these environmental laws so that industry can kind of do whatever it wants to do. Individuals don't want to be regulated by government agencies. There's an enormous outrage because the government is regulating more, and underneath that is a drive to be totally unregulated, which is a return to that infantile innocence. That this pushing away of responsibility is part of a regressive process which doesn't just create problems for the society and the neighborhood, but also prevents the evolution of the psyche, interferes with our own maturational process.
Right. Because to grow and transform, we have to confront our guilt. And we touched on this earlier, but I think I want to lift it up really loud and clear because it is important to us, is that oftentimes what happens when someone comes into an analysis is that it is, at least in the beginning, a real confession. And not always, but many times there's something that someone is holding or carrying, some old guilt that they need to, and it may be something real, like I had an affair, but it might be something almost a sort of maladaptive belief, that I'm a bad person and I upset people wherever I go, and in either case, it's up to the analyst to receive that without retribution, and then help the person sort out what is the right way to relate to that. Is it to atone, or is it to kind of do some reality testing about what's true? And certainly what we do as analysts often is kind of play father confessor and help people change their relationship with their guilt so that it doesn't hold them back. And I just want to read this quote from Jung, which I think is relevant. "The patient who comes to us has a story that is not told and which, as a rule, no one knows of. To my mind, therapy only really begins after the investigation of that wholly personal story. It is the patient's secret, the rock against which he is shattered." So Jung doesn't say, that the secret involves guilt, but I think it sometimes does, at least.
Well,
and so that's a very serious, somber part of doing the work that we do, is holding people's secrets.
I think that's so important and I think this is related to guilt, whether or not it has anything to do with the outer culture. But there is some kind of an infraction in the internal environment that gives people the sense that they must keep something secret, all kinds of things secret, that if anyone were to know, that some terrible consequence would happen. And out of fear of the consequence, all kinds of energy, all kinds of capacities in the personality get locked up behind a kind of wall. Being able to confess, to pierce the neurotic isolation, one, relieves an enormous amount of anxiety. Just to witness that the analyst, just as you said, Lisa, is not going to punish you in the way that you fear you're going to be punished. And then to be able to think about it so that the analyst can then start interpreting the confession in a wider psychological lens. To be able to relate why we did something or other because of various factors internally and externally. Because as analysts, we have a sense that all of our psychological responses are the best possible response that we are capable of at a given moment in time, given all factors, some of which could be highly mysterious, like genetic and biological factors that we're only understanding right now. But it's a particularly optimistic view of the psyche and of human beings, that we are not aligned with wanton destruction. It's not the blueprint that human beings have been made from. But when we have a set of beliefs, life experiences, all kinds of conditions, and as I said, maybe even genetics, certain kinds of shocking and pain-inducing behaviors can come out of us as the best response that we can muster in a given moment. And so in receiving the confession part of what we try to do over time, because we have to learn a lot of things about the other person, is to understand it in a much deeper level as an interplay of various inner figures, complexes, memories, emotions that compel the ego into a particular state at a particular moment, with the hope that if that is brought into consciousness, the human capacity for choice is restored. When we're compelled secretly from the underground, we may think we have choice, but actually we probably don't have a lot of choice, because these other things are kind of driving the car, pulling the levers, pressing the buttons, and distorting even our sense of truth.
You know, I think we've just come full circle. We started with consciousness, and we're coming back to choice, which implies consciousness, that I take all these things into consideration and I make a choice of dealing with my shadow, atoning, maybe reframing and putting things in a different perspective, whatever that might be. It's conscious, and that makes all the difference.
Anytime there is choice, then the ego has to weigh all kinds of factors. I'll share one last quote. As Jung was analyzing the Judeo-Christian mythos, and he's again looking at this idea of the Garden of Eden and what is that saying in terms of archetypal development, he writes, "Sheer instinctuality and naive unconsciousness, untroubled by a sense of guilt, would prevail if the master," which Jung means by God, "had not interrupted the free development of the natural being by introducing a distinction between good and evil, and outlawing the evil. Since without guilt there is no moral consciousness, and without awareness of differences, no consciousness at all. We must concede that the strange intervention of the Master of Souls was absolutely necessary for the development of any kind of consciousness, and in this sense was for the good."
Before we switch to a dream, I just want to let everyone know about Dream School. Dream School is a 12-month program that was designed by the three of us, in which we walk you through step-by-step how to work with dreams. So you'll learn everything that you need to know to begin to unpack the meaning of your own dreams. There are live events with the three of us every month and a really warm community. And so we hope that you'll check it out. So come on over to thisjungianlife.com and you can see there an opportunity to learn more about Dream School.
Okay. And now we'll go to a dream. And this week's dreamer is a woman who's 30 years old. She's a teacher. And here's the dream. My parents had sent me to a monastery as I was pregnant. In real life, I'm not pregnant, nor do I wish to be, and don't, in fact, have a partner, so the father origin of this child was unclear. I was in a very dark, beautiful room. It was medieval Tudor in style, so very basic but beautiful, rich red velvet drapes and dark wood-carved tables. I was standing at a window, harsh light hitting me in the darkness, and I felt the birthing process begin. Something came out of me, and I just reached down and grabbed it. There was no blood or mess, just this parcel almost wrapped in white cloth. I brought it up to my chest to look at it, and there was my child, but something was wrong. It wasn't fully formed, and parts of it were still skeleton with no flesh and blood at all. Strange little feet, and structures like wings, like the thing I'd given birth to was a bird-human hybrid. Immediately, I cried for help from the inhabitants of the monastery, asking them to tell me if my child was in fact alive. I noticed wrapped up in this parcel was also a little statuette of the Virgin Mary and Christ as a baby. I thought, how has this come out of me? They took the child away, and I ran around the monastery distressed as to whether it was alive and would make it. I discovered it was in fact a healthy boy, and I was relieved and went to find my family and discuss names. They were deep in prayer and very concerned to give it a religious name, which was very odd to me, being that this is out of character. And then I woke up. For context, the dreamer says, my mother identifies as Christian but isn't intensely religious, and my father is an atheist. I've changed my mind about my faith a number of times in my life, but would now identify as spiritual but not Christian, though I work at a Christian school. I've recently broken up with a boyfriend, and I'm thinking a lot about the future and what kind of relationship may or may not be good for me. She says the main feelings in the dream were confusion around the heavily religious context and imagery, and a huge amount of concern and love for my child, even though in real life I don't have a burning desire to become a parent, especially anytime soon. I think the baby is symbolic of something else. And she adds, the monastery was beautiful and romantic, but harsh and frightening at the same time. The baby was, quote, broken and strange, but I loved it so much. Perhaps this is an aspect of myself or symbolic of past relationships. I care a lot about my family's approval, so their presence seemed more about validation and concern about what they thought. The lighting seemed of particular importance, but I'm not sure why, as well as the colors.
Well, the first thing that I find myself being curious about is really just the first sentence. My parents had sent me to a monastery as I was pregnant. And this is a thing that happened. It happened in Europe, it happened in the United States earlier, that if a woman became pregnant outside of wedlock particularly, it was considered an enormous problem, perhaps very shameful, based on kind of religious ideas of purity and not being sex outside of marriage. And so high school girls, for instance, were swept away to these religious institutions to bear their children, who would then often be almost forcibly taken away for adoption. And then the young women would be returned as if they had not given birth to a child. So there's a complicated history about being sent to a religious institution because someone is pregnant. I do want to say that she did not speak to that in her context, but it evokes it for me.
It's there in the real world.
Yeah.
Well, it's so interesting too, kind of being sent there by her parents, right? You know, so there's something here about the parental complexes, kind of feeling, sort of forced to be here. I am somehow in the realm of she doesn't know who the father is. It's mysterious. How did she get pregnant? That calls, and given that we're in this religious context.
Yes, it was. Didn't that happen once upon a time?
Or at least allegedly.
Mm-hmm. We're thinking of exactly the same thing. That there was
that
once
also, because she kind of gives birth to this little statuette of the Virgin and the Christ child. So it and in that story, Mary is, God has to come down and tell Joseph, hey, go ahead and marry her. It's, she actually is still a virgin, even though she's pregnant, so that sense of being kind of outcast, perhaps, and yet revered. That paradox.
And I think our dreamer is really onto something where she says, I think the baby is symbolic.
You think?
But here's a young woman, age 30, not married, isn't interested in having children, maybe ever, but certainly not anytime soon. Who has almost this sort of parthenogenic birth of she's magically, mysteriously pregnant. And I think that's the big question in the dream is, what has she given birth to? And I'm paying attention to the fact that it looks somewhat monstrous, not fully formed. Parts of it were still skeleton with no flesh and blood, little strange feet and structures like wings, like the thing I'd given birth to was a bird-human hybrid. She cries for help, and then in her comments, she talks about how much she loved it.
Well, if we're going with this theme of the virgin birth, and certainly the dream really takes us there with all of this religious imagery. You know, it's the Middle Ages, it's a monastery. She gives birth to a little statuette.
Yes.
There is this sense that she has given birth to, the Son of God. She has given birth to the divine child. And the divine child is, interestingly, part bird, which birds are associated with spirit, always, strongly. And so, and it's, and she immediately is worried about it, which I think is a really good thing. She's not disgusted by it. She's worried. She loves it. She wants help. And there is help available, which is also good. I don't know what is going on in her psyche to have a dream like this. I'm struck by the fact that she says she recently broke up with a boyfriend. Don't know more about it than that. But sometimes if we have a significant breakup, that can be such a wrenching loss, especially for a woman who is this age, because sometimes, she's young, but, women can start to feel like, when am I going to figure this out? I thought this was going to be the one. It can cause us to feel such a sense of deep despair that we really are cast back on ourselves and are forced, I think, in a way that can be very helpful to grapple with who we are, what we want, what is our relationship with the cosmos, that we're no longer kind of maybe waiting to just slide into a marriage, but we have to do some real stock taking. So all of this is in my imagination. None of it's here. But boy, she's had some big psychic event here, because she's given birth to the divine child.
When I take that in and just think about some of the sequencing, that the trouble is that a harsh light hitting me in the darkness, and I feel the process begin. And so it puts me into this realm of timing, that it's not uncommon when we are gestating a creative project, a new goal, a new career, or even a new personality aspect. It needs to gestate in the darkness within ourselves, and it needs to gestate between us and the unconscious. Often what can happen is, if it is harshly examined, harshly evaluated too soon, our projects will become aborted. So, for instance, this happens so ubiquitously, I think we barely notice it. And we're driving with a friend, and we say, I'm thinking about going back to school and getting a master's in poetry. And then the friend turns around and says, what are you, crazy? You're an attorney. You make a fortune. You've got all these responsibilities. That's ridiculous. I mean, just read a couple of books or something like that. Or any other kind of non-holding response can come into us at a point where we can't quite defend this nascent possibility, and we can jettison. We can psychologically abort a potential because it's been examined in too harsh of a light. So I suspect that what comes out of her has been met with perhaps her own harsh criticisms or a kind of cold intellectual assessment too soon, or that was perhaps delivered to her by someone or some kind of a system. It comes out as a kind of parcel, and she's able to see the potential in it. It should be alive. It has bones. It has wings. It might have flown. Her plan to be a poet could have taken flight. And she's, incredibly distressed. And if we think about it as perhaps a creative plan, she needs to know if it's still viable. Could I still go and move somewhere else, change my career, start a new life? Then something happens where the child is taken away from her. It's taken out of the hands of the ego. She doesn't know where it is, and she doesn't know if it's still viable. She says that she's told that it's a healthy boy, but wherever it is, it's not gestating inside of her anymore.
My thought here, given the bracketing of this dream at the beginning and at the end with parental references, is, her parents sent her to a monastery because she was pregnant and presumably to deliver. And then at the end, when she discovers that her baby is a healthy boy, she goes to find her family, discuss names, and they're deep in prayer, concerned to give it a religious name. So I am wondering about the parental complex of her parents and the monastery, the mother church, part of the mother church, and how or if she gives away her own creative project, her own symbolic, metaphorical, creative children to authorities, whether they're parents or institutions of some kind. She says the lighting, which you talked about, Joseph, the harsh lighting was of particular importance. And she also mentions in her comments that she cares a lot about her family's approval. And yet this is her baby with its funny little feet and maybe wings, and comes out looking pretty peculiar. Turns out, however, it's a healthy boy. It belongs to her, not her parents, not the monastery.
Another element that just piques my curiosity is that there's a difference between a monastery and a convent. Sure. Monasteries are run and organized by men. If this is a Catholic monastery, celibacy would be expected, versus a convent. Of course, again, celibacy is one of the many rules and restraints that are observed, but she's been sent to a community of celibate religious men who ostensibly are committed to embodying the path of Christ, the path of Jesus. And yet she's a woman and she's pregnant, which is a really interesting juxtaposition. And of course, historically, pregnant women would not have been sent to a monastery. It would have been a convent. So it's interesting that she's put into this world of the masculine to give birth to this boy inside of her. So part of the possibility is this premature birth of an animus capacity, a masculine capacity in herself. I'd recently come across a quote from von Franz that I'm not going to remember fully, but she's writing about the positive animus that emerges in a woman's imagination, sometimes as an angelic figure. And she compares this to the experience of Joan of Arc, that the Archangel Michael appeared to her in visions and advised her personal life, her political life, her military career. And it was...
And how'd that work out for her?
Well, von Franz would say... von Franz would say that this was of the spirit of truth and the spirit of her destiny. The fact that she suffered greatly doesn't necessarily suggest that it's not congruent with the self, as we know for all of us. So for her to give birth to this angelic masculine, hopefully her perception that it is healthy and it's going to continue to develop, could suggest that our higher animus is emerging, that it has yet to be clearly defined, and as children are, they're often put in an incubator to be able to survive until they can self-support. The fact that the child requires a religious name and that a religious context is imposed on the dream is congruent with Marie-Louise von Franz's idea of the progression of the animus, starting with a kind of earthy, masculine, sensate quality up to a kind of internal spirit of spiritual truth inside of a woman's psyche. So there's certainly some disturbing elements in the dream, particularly the way the light hits her and she does seem to prematurely birth. But some of the other elements also seem to have a valence that are congruent with this idea of the progression of the animus.
I like that, Joseph.
You've been listening to This Jungian Life. From our website, thisjungianlife.com, you can follow us on Twitter, like us on Facebook, help us produce future episodes by funding us through Patreon, and submit your dreams for possible interpretation on another episode. We'd like to thank our listener who shared a dream for today's show and hope you'll let us know what topics you'd enjoy hearing more about. Until next time, keep living this Jungian life.